All right, welcome everyone who's joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Olka Joshi-Hansen. I'm Chief Program Officer at Grantmakers for Education. And on behalf of our Executive Director, Celine Coggins, and other members of our team who are here, we want to welcome you to the second in our series on funding Asian American and Pacific Islanders. Just for a bit of context for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, in the wake of COVID, in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and anti-Asian, anti-Black hate in this country, we felt that we wanted to put together programming that really allowed funders to dive deep and learn a little bit more about communities and populations that they might not have traditionally served, to kind of help elevate some of the kind of issues and history that funders would want to be aware of. The first session that we held in this series was in September, and you'll be able to find it on our website. And that was with Janelle Wong from the University of Maryland and Jonathan Tran from the California Endowment, who were joined by Kenji Trainer from the Stewart Foundation. And that was a starting session that gave us a sense of the historical and contemporary forces that shape the racial position of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the US today. A lot about the intra and intergroup dynamics that impact those communities, as well as their relationship with other underserved communities in the US. During that session, the issue of data disaggregation came up. That data disaggregation is an incredibly important part of funding the Asian American and Pacific Islander community because there's such differences within different subgroups. We also were talking a lot about local organizations and the fact that it's often smaller local organizations that are most funding Asian American and Pacific Islanders inside their community. So we're happy today to be joined by a great panel where we'll be able to dig in a bit into both of those issues. And I want to hand you over now to Sue Coy from Ascendium Education Group, who will be our moderator and will introduce the panel. Thank you so much, Sue.
Thanks, Olka. I'm thrilled to moderate this important conversation today. I'm Sue Choi. I'm a Senior Program Officer at Ascendium Education Group. And before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I'd like to do a little bit of level setting around terminology. While the term Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI for short, is commonly used, it's important to recognize the great diversity of communities that this composite term encompasses. The AAPI population is composed of 50 ethnic groups speaking over 100 different languages. There are rich differences in cultures, histories, and experiences between those that identify as Asian American and those as Pacific Islander. Our speakers will also be referencing the population of Southeast Asians, which include Cambodians, Hmong, Laotians, and Vietnamese, as well as those from Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Brunei, and East Timor. Our speakers will be discussing why disaggregating data is one way to ensure that we're being specific and targeted in our approaches to supporting these communities. And with that, it's my privilege to introduce our four panelists. We'll be hearing from Jessica Yin, the Policy Analyst for K-12 Education at Center for American Progress, Quyen Dinh, Executive Director at the Southeast Asia Resource Center, Chanda Womack, Founding Executive Director for the Alliance of Rhode Island Southeast Asians for Education, and lastly, Ellen Wong, Senior Program Officer at the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. Each panelist will now give a few minutes of opening remarks before we turn to a broader group conversation. Jessica Yin is up first, then Quyen Dinh. Turning it over to you now, Jessica.
Thanks so much. So I'm just going to start by giving a little bit of an overview about what disaggregated data is, how can it be used to support the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, and sort of what lessons to keep in mind as we're looking towards next steps. So very simplistically, disaggregated data is just data that has been divided into specific subcategories. So for example, you can take student achievement data and disaggregate it by the student's race and ethnicity. Oftentimes in conversations about Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, as Sue mentioned, it is important and folks are advocating for data to be disaggregated at an extremely specific level. So not just disaggregating Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but going into the subgroups that form and are part of those communities. And there are a lot of benefits to that, chiefly among them being that if you are able to identify, the specific experiences of Southeast Asians, for example, or Samoans and Tongans, then you're able to identify trends that might be masked by the bigger Asian American and Pacific Islander groups. And if you can see those specific trends, then you can develop policies to support those specific groups. So just a couple of examples that we can already see from existing disaggregated data. One, there are already existing disparities between Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Without disaggregating, for example, data has shown that 12% of Asian American and Pacific Islander children come from families living in poverty. But if you look at the graph, if you disaggregate Asian Americans from Pacific Islanders, you can see that Pacific Islanders, 23% of Pacific Islander children come from families living in poverty. And so if you didn't disaggregate those two communities out from each other, the aggregate number would be really inaccurate to what the experiences of Pacific Islander children actually are, and therefore miss an opportunity to introduce policies to better and more accurately address the situation. In addition to disparities between the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, within each of these communities, there are disparities that emerge when you disaggregate. For example, Asian American students collectively only had a dropout rate of 2%. But if you disaggregate, Bangladeshi students had a 4% dropout rate, and Burmese students had a dropout rate of nearly 30%. So again, if you didn't disaggregate, you would not be able to identify that Burmese students are experiencing a really different situation than Asian Americans as a collective. And that's something that as a school, you need to be looking into and addressing. And later on, both Quyen and Chanda will talk a little bit about the experiences of Southeast Asians, but you can see from the graph at the bottom that I did borrow from SEARAC, so thank you, that Southeast Asians do have sort of lower educational attainment in terms of associate's degree than Asian Americans as a collective. And again, without disaggregation, you wouldn't be able to see that and address policies to that group in particular. So this kind of work of taking a race equity lens and applying it to K-12 education is something that CAP really centers as its mission on the K-12 education team. In early 2022, myself and my colleague Robbie published a report focused on the K-12 educational needs of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We did a literature review and identified 6 policy areas we think required more research and more policy efforts, one of which was data disaggregation. But in addition to a literature review, we wanted to have conversations with Asian American and Pacific Islander educators, students, families, and community members, because their lived experiences should really be at the center of what policies we're advocating for and how. So already, Robbie and I conducted 2 virtual conversations in February, one with Asian Americans and one with Pacific Islanders. And then in March, we conducted some in-person conversations with Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in Seattle. And some of the takeaways that we found from these conversations is that, one, data disaggregation work is not as far along as we would like it to be. There are very few people that we spoke to who could identify schools that had disaggregated data and then had made subsequent policy changes based on that disaggregated data. And so this really, highlighted to us that not only is there still the need to fund data disaggregation work, but there's a need to fund that work all the way through implementation and follow up through to policy changes. The second takeaway that we found is that community organizations often hold so much of the expertise about how to support their communities, but they are often not the ones that are getting the funding directly. They are often have to compete with each other in order to get funding from school districts. And so a lot of community members advocated that the funding should really be going directly to them so that they can decide what school districts to work for and to really be empowered and respected for the expertise that they have. Additionally, they mentioned that a lot of times if they do get funding, there are a lot of really stringent rules and expectations that come with that. And that really sort of, to them, demonstrates a lack of trust in their ability to know what they're doing. And so they wanted, fewer strings and a little bit more understanding that they do know what they're doing and they do know how to support their communities. So both of these topics are things that Quyen and Chanda will talk about a little bit more. So I will stop there, but hopefully this helped set the scene a little bit.
Thanks, Jessica. Over to Quyen.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you all for making time out of our busy lives these days to be part of this conversation. I think what was one of my main takeaways from CAP's beautiful report is that this issue of data disaggregation is not new, and that the disparities that you shared, the charts that you shared aren't new. And for SEARAC, the fact that it isn't new is incredibly heartbreaking. And it's exactly the reason why this issue is so important, because it really indicates that we're seeing generational inequity that has persisted and that's been pervasive. And we have to understand that the reason why this issue is not new is because our country's system of aggregating all Asians under one category is institutionalized systemic racism that perpetuates and enables the mono-minority myth. And the inequities in the data that we see are really the result of vulnerable communities being invisible, being erased, and being disinvested in for generations. So at SEARAC, and a lot of y'all already know this, and so I think I definitely don't want to preach to the choir, but just to emphasize that at SEARAC, this issue is so important and so personal for us because we represent communities from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam who are the largest community of refugees ever resettled in America, starting with 1.3 million refugees, including folks like my mom and dad who risked their lives on the open oceans in the South China Seas, not knowing if they would live or die, so that today I could be free. Today, our communities number over 2.5 million. And for us, this fight is personal because behind each bar graph, behind each statistic is the heartbreak of a lost brother and a lost sister who has been failed by our education system for a generation. And for over 2 decades, SEARAC has worked to advocate for national data disaggregation because we believe that dismantling institutionalized racism and institutionalized systemic barriers requires policy change and requires that this change must be led by the faces and the voices of those who are most impacted. We believe that this fight is about our right to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued. And the inequity isn't dismantled in 3 to 5 years as our strategic plans are written. It takes generations of leadership and community power to fight and win. That's why we're so honored to have started a national Southeast Asian American movement to reclaim our power by calling and standing up to say that all students count. A lot of you all may have been part of this movement in some way, but together with parents, with students, with educators, and with legislators, our communities are demanding that our country's data systems catch up to the reality of the diversity that we have as a community and as a country by simply providing more checkboxes so that our young people can say that they're not just Asian, that they're Cambodian, Hmong, Lao, Vietnamese, Tongan, Fijian, and to finally reveal rather than conceal the huge systemic barriers that have existed for far too long so that we as a community have the power to disrupt these inequities and to prevent these opportunity gaps from growing into another generation. Through the last reauthorization of the Now Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, we were 2 votes shy of getting national AAPI K-12 data disaggregation. It is so heartbreaking and one of the biggest lessons learned of my career and for SEARAC, but we have support from over 160 organizations from across 27 states, from over 1,000 young people and parents who joined with us in our All Students Count Tumblr. And even though we haven't seen our national win, we're so proud to have supported the wave of state-won data disaggregation policies in Washington, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, including by our fierce partners at Arise. And I'm so honored to be sharing space today with Chanda to be able to share with you all more of the lessons learned and what that battle looks like now. With Chanda, with leaders from across the country and across 2 decades of work, we believe that we constantly learn from our mistakes and challenges. And we believe that we will win data disaggregation within our children's lifetime. And in my reflection, I wanted to share just 3 lessons learned of what it means to really fight for systems change. First is that fighting for systemic change is fighting the long game. It requires long-term funding for every lever required to win, from building political will to community demand and narrative shift. And it requires investment at the local, state, and national level. The second is that funding requires a growth mindset, knowing that failures are part of winning, and it's leaders and organizations who learn from their biggest mistakes that make the biggest transformations. And finally, funding the long game also includes not just passing policies, but implementing policies, which we'll hear about in a lot more depth. Because we know that data disaggregation is just the first critical step to closing these inequities. Data itself has the power to reveal, but it requires political will and community demand to heal. And for us, this means being prepared to fight back against the nitty-gritty details, the excuses, the very real lack of resources, and the rebuilding and reimagining of new systems. And finally, I just wanted to end by sharing that for us, we believe that this fight for data disaggregation isn't about the numbers. It's about our community self-determination for generations to come, including the next generation, my son Kai, who is sitting on my lap in this picture. We believe that this fight is for our communities to define itself rather than be defined by institutions, that our fight isn't done, but that we will win, that we will see national data disaggregation, where our students know that they belong, that they matter in a multicultural America, and in communities that are collectively fighting back and building new institutions that see them, that serve them, and that allow us to heal for generations to come. Thank you all so much. Really look forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much. Chanda, the floor is yours.
Okay, Chanda Womack here, the Executive Director of Arise. Just a little bit about who we are, right? Kind of want to set the stage. We are an education adjacent organization, and we were actually founded to elevate the educational needs, stories, and narratives of Southeast Asian students and families. And we really want to be explicit. For Arise, Southeast Asians, it's a political identity. So we're talking about folks who are indigenous to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, who were impacted and displaced by the Vietnam War, the secret war in Laos, and the Khmer Rouge genocide. I think that organizational artifacts tells stories. So we like to use organizational artifacts to tell our stories. Our mission is combining leadership development as well as community organizing with Southeast Asian students and students of color to fight for education justice. We do this work through a Black liberation lens. And what that means is that we recognize how Black bodies have been historically treated and how they interface within our own, within the US, how they interface with systems and how systems of oppression see them. And Quyen did a beautiful job really just naming the ways in which oppression works institutionally, interpersonally, and ideologically. So just a little bit of our campaign work. Our work is youth-led, right? So young people in our space are equipped with the tools to navigate the education system. But more importantly, they're also equipped with the critical analysis, the social conscious lens to also challenge these systems that are not serving them as whole people. So some of the campaign work that our young people have taken on are our Counselors Not Cops campaign. We're really fighting for police-free schools. Arise became a founding member of the coalition about 2.5 years ago, right? Our school's PVD, we were founded in 2019. We came together to say, hey, the state takeover of the largest school district in Rhode Island has to center the voices of young people and parents and community. they just launched and announced their campaign, which is ethnic studies, at the end of 2021. Our young people also became plaintiffs, right? In the Cook versus Raimondo lawsuit. It's a nationally known lawsuit where Rhode Island students and parents and families and community came together to sue the state to say, like, we need a constitutional right to an adequate civics education. If we win this lawsuit, it would mean that we're winning a constitutional right for all students in the US. Ethnic studies, when ARISE was first founded, we knew that our communities were faced with a high undiagnosed PTSD, right? So we wanted to use ethnic studies as a tool for radical healing, as well as to disrupt intergenerational trauma. So while we developed our own curriculum, we also partnered with the school districts to offer the curriculum. We were recognized in 2020 in Prominent's annual Who to Watch, known as a change maker, right? Challenging mediocrity. And this work is led by young people, those who are most impacted by the issue. So y'all probably saying, like, well, what does this got to do with data disaggregation, data equity? A whole lot. So you'll see here, right? Quickly, Jessica referred to this earlier. In the aggregate, persons over 25 with a bachelor's degree, this is also something that I borrowed from SEARAC years ago. All Asians is at 61%, right? But if you look at the disaggregate, if you look at our Vietnamese brothers and sisters, if you look at the Khmer community, the Lao community, and the Hmong community, that number tells a different story. And what we're saying is data disaggregation is a civil rights issue. And what we're saying is that we have been invisibilized because of data aggregation. So when we were first founded in 2017, the first fight we took on was our own version of the All Students Count Act, which laid the foundation for all of the work that came after that. We became the third state to pass the bill. And the way that we organized through a multi-generational and multiracial lens. So we were just not organizing Southeast Asian orgs. We were also organizing orgs led by other people of color. So this is I would say, our model of how we organized, where we mobilized legislators. Young people were in the forefront and at the center of testimonies. We mobilized college access organization, policy orgs, national orgs, and we were able to get support from the districts that had the highest concentration of Southeast Asian students. All 4 of them signed on, including the Rhode Island Department of Education. And you'll see that we won. Y'all, we won. We passed this bill in 2016, 2017. RIDE told us that it would take a year for them to kind of put systems in place to be able to implement the policy. So 2016, 2017 legislative session, 2017, 2018 was the wait for them to put systems and offer guidance to districts. In 2018 and 2019, they would begin collecting the data. So in Rhode Island, there are 33 local education agencies, LEAs. Providence, Woonsocket, and Cranston have the highest concentration of Southeast Asian students. So you'll see here the 4-year result of the implementation of the bill. What we learned. So Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Department of Education, when the bill was passed, what we learned was that the guidance that came from RIDE was not very clear. And it basically gave districts the autonomy to implement the bill in whatever way worked best for them. So the intention was to decenter that power, right, to the local LEAs. But what happened as an impact, where there was a lot of ambiguity, confusion, lack of institutional knowledge, experiential knowledge, to be able to carry out that work. as such, the 4 years in which they have collected the data, they have not collected it or stewarded the bill with fidelity, I would say. We, for a long time, was kind of being that understanding community-based organization, right? Was like, okay, what are the ways that we could support, with collecting data? So we were doing a lot of asking and offering, because there's this power dynamic, right? Like, we want Rhode Island Department of Education to implement this bill. We want it to be implemented in the ways that it's intended to be implemented. Then COVID hit, so we were being more empathetic and compassionate to the ways in which they were not showing up. So this year, I would say about 4 months now, we said, hey, Nellie Mae, we need your support. Implementation is really a struggle for us right now, and we need some funds to be able to do this work. We love Nellie Mae, they're part of our movement family, no questions asked. It's like, okay, we got you. So what we did was we brought our own team of researchers in to assess the current implementation of ASCA, so that we can begin to look at the barriers that were getting in the way of being able to implement this with fidelity. We also asked the Rhode Island Department of Education to also to also help fund this work, to pay for our researcher. And they have been extremely cooperative and really want to do this work right. So I definitely want to give them a shout out. The leadership has definitely been open to us doing this research and really want to help in the ways that they can. So our researcher has been conducting interviews, right, hosting focus groups. And one of the things that we were very clear about was that I need you all to talk to the people who are at the grassroots level collecting this data, right? The information can get to the principal, but the person that's collecting the data, do they have the knowledge to really encourage families to provide this information? Are they going to do the political education around why this information is important? So we wanted to make sure that the folks who were at the grassroots level doing this work was reached, and that their voices were going to be centered, including our parents and including our families who's being asked for this information. Our goal is to develop this beautiful toolkit that's really going to help us and other states implement the policy once it's passed, y'all. Because honestly, while it was difficult to pass the policy, it's so much harder. What we're learning is that it's so much harder to implement it. And we're hoping to develop this partnership framework between an institution like the Rhode Island Department of Education with the community-based organizations that's really, that has that knowledge of our communities, right? That has the experiential and intellectual knowledge of our communities. And so this is something that it's going to probably produce something in late October, early November. But the work is, I would say, phenomenal.
Thank you so much. And lastly, our final presenter before we move into a group conversation will be Ellen. And as Ellen is wrapping up her comments, ask all of our attendees to please think about a question that you might want to be asked, and GFE will help to filter it up to the top, and hope that in the next half of this presentation, we can have a more robust conversation. So Ellen, please.
Thanks so much, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited and very honored to be on this panel with folks doing such important work. By way of introduction, I thought I'd just first share a little bit about some of the things that brought me into philanthropy, particularly education philanthropy. So prior to joining Nellie Mae, I worked with first-generation Asian American and Asian immigrant youth at the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, which is a multi-service community-based organization here in Boston, Massachusetts. And this program primarily served young people whose parents worked in restaurants, hotels, and nail salons. And the young people were often the first in their families to attend college. And so, as a staff person who worked closely with the young people, I still remember just the amount of time and effort and frustration I experienced trying to convince funders that the young people we served, along with their families, were indeed navigating complex needs and challenges. So I think this experience of trying to, dispel the model minority myth with funders has stayed with me, particularly as we think about how the needs of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students have historically been rendered invisible within the context of K-12 public education, like so many of the panelists have already talked about. And at Nellie Mae, we champion efforts to prioritize community goals that challenge racial inequities and advance student-centered public education for all New England youth. So we do this in a number of ways, including supporting organizations that center young people, caregivers, and educators of color through coalition building, as well as advancing community and district partnerships that are seeking to dismantle racial equity barriers for students of color. I should say this is a strategy that is still relatively new for us, and we embarked on this journey in early 2020 at the onset of the pandemic. And it's important to note that many foundations have come before us in doing this kind of work. And what sort of brought us to this shift or to this place in our strategy is that we in part realize that schools and districts cannot and really should not operate alone to address these issues of structural racism in public education, and that where often there can be change or churn in district and school leadership, we know that it is the community, particularly communities of color, and those who are most proximate to the issues that are the constant for our youth of color, who are most impacted by structural racism. So we have been on a journey, I think, to take a more of a racial equity approach to our grant making, both in terms of how resources are allocated and making sure that we continue to center the voices of those most impacted. And one way we are doing this is through our community advisory, which is a group of young people, parents, educators, and community leaders that are compensated to provide strategic input and guidance to the foundation. We're really grateful to have ARISE as both a grantee partner and its fearless leader, Chanda, in the role of a Nellie Mae community advisor. In addition to ARISE, we fund a couple of other Asian American organizations, as well as a coalition that are working on data disaggregation, because this is really about, it's an education justice issue is what it is. And as Jessica mentioned in her opening remarks, it's important to directly fund the community-based organizations who are well positioned to do this work within their communities. We've also released several rapid response funds in response to the rise of documented anti-Asian hate, focused on supporting our Asian American communities and the organizations that serve them. And later on, I'll talk a little bit more about the learnings and some potential takeaways for any funders that are on this call, but I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So still waiting to see more questions in the chat, but I'll kick this off by asking if you all can uplift some good models, just philanthropy catnip. Are there examples of districts or states that are doing this data disaggregation well? And when funders talk to prospective partners about data disaggregation, what's your advice for us on how we might recognize quality and thoughtfulness? For anyone to answer.
I can start with some of the examples, the best practices. It's really, really hard to find. I think from what we've seen, Seattle Public Schools actually is one of the only school districts in the country that actually collects and reports out on disaggregated data. The challenge here is that there are states like Hawaii and California who collect K-12 disaggregated data, but they don't report it out. And the bottom line, what we've heard is that a lot of these state education agencies will not report it out unless it's absolutely required and mandated. It's what we've heard over and over and over again. I do think, though, that connecting what Chanda shared around implementation challenges, what we're seeing as bright spots are coming out of New York, for example. So New York just passed their data disaggregation bill, I think maybe a month or two ago. It impacts all state education agencies who currently collect disaggregated data. So this would include their Department of Education. And their advocates knew to start the advocacy on advocating for resources and funding for data disaggregation implementation from the very beginning of the campaign. And some of their community organizations actually been funded by the governor directly. First, to do COVID response work, particularly creating safety and healing against AAPI hate and violence. But there's also a conversation about actually implementing data disaggregation. I think that across SEARAC's communities, these are the leaders arise, like Rhode Island, and what you all are trying to champion and what we're learning right now. But there is no perfect model out there, but there are lots of attempts. And so for us, Rhode Island, Washington, and Minnesota are those states to watch out for.
And I think that because we don't have these examples, Arise was like, okay, we can no longer sit and lean on this institution to carry it out in the ways in which we imagine it to be carried out. So there was this moment of like, oh my God, we need to take on more of a leadership role and center our communities in the ways in which we see this being carried out. So, this was a time for us to say, oh my gosh, let's adopt this plan, like let's shift from what we were doing as a, hey, are you guys doing it? Hey, can you send us the data? And the pushback was always, well, we are disaggregating it, but we can't report it because there isn't a statistical significance. And then my question is like, well, y'all don't got a statistical significance because y'all ain't been collecting it, right? Like, so we're hoping that this cool toolkit, this framework, really helps communities as they begin to pass their own version of the bill, think about implementation more intentionally and think about implementation as you're advocating for the bill. So there's a lot of learnings that has been happening, and SEARAC has actually been the convener and has actually funded the states who passed the bill to follow through with the implementation for multiple years now.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly too that like a lot of folks have talked about how data disaggregation is the tool. It's not just the end goal. So I think if you're looking at folks with plans for data disaggregation, also that plan for, and here's the structure in place to take what we learned from disaggregated data and do something about it. Like if you don't have the levers in place or the plan in place to do that, then you're not carrying that fully to its end goal.
On that point of using the data, one of the questions from our community is inquiring about the support that should be provided for some of the state agencies and our community partners in order to report this data. How should we as funders think about what that support should look like that would better establish any of our partners to be able to provide the data in a thoughtful way to us that takes into consideration student privacy issues and the contextualization that needs to happen around the data to make sense of it. Any insights?
I think taking a step back, I think one of the main factors is partnership across state agencies and community-based organizations. There really needs to be a partnership from the very beginning to understand, what type of data exactly are we capturing? And that is really important for the community. And to have a very direct dialogue about that end goal before you even talk about reinventing the surveys and adding check boxes and copying and pasting new boxes from the Census Bureau and then figuring out the statistical and it shifts to the the fiscal systems. But first and foremost, it is, I think, supporting those partnerships, the forging of those partnerships by funding community-based organizations to be that advocate with their community, and so that they do have the capacity and resources to be advocating with the education agencies, like ARISE is doing with Rhode Island Department of Education, for example. And I do think that from there, the answers become pretty clear about what are the resources necessary, whether it is adding a couple more staff members to the State Department's data team, or whether it's updating a few tweaks to the data system. It's completely doable, but it's about having that conversation and that partnership built from the very beginning.
Quyen, if I could just also add, I think, it's important for funders to support this work if it isn't obvious through multi-year general operating support, because as an example, this is one strand of the work that ARISE has been doing in addition to their youth organizing work and the various other supports that they offer their organization or their community rather. So it's probably hopefully obvious to the funders that are on this call, but if not, that has to be the way to go, and that just we are going to fund this specific project for data disaggregation alone.
I would also say what has been sort of a game changer and critical moment for ARISE prior to taking on this research project was an intentional partnership with a policy org that has really been rooted in the community and centering sort of anti-racist work, inclusivity. And for us in Rhode Island, that's Rhode Island Kids Count, who's been around for decades. And when we brought them to the table, there was this renewed energy, just because they had the language. This is what they do, right? This is what they were founded to. They had the language, they had the access, and they had the ear of those who were in power to like, hey, y'all are not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're actually violating the law here. Let us help you. Let us help you. Let us give you the tools to be able to steward this bill and honor the communities that this bill is going to support. So I would say that is absolutely a game changer. Speaking to Quyen's sort of urging of partnerships.
Following up on the discussion of using data and partnerships for advancing the stories and the narratives and the advocacy work that the data can help to tell you stories about. Are there any practices that you might caution us to stay away from or to be aware of? What is data disaggregation or disaggregated data not as helpful for? Or how should we be cautious when working with disaggregated data? What can you not really learn from a fuller set of data?
Not to repeat myself, but I think it's less what you don't want to learn as much as like, we heard sometimes that school districts will get stuck on being like, well, maybe we can do another slice and another slice and another slice and another slice, rather than acting on even like the information they've already had from their passive data disaggregation. So using the potentially ongoing ability to always disaggregate a little bit further as an excuse to not take action based on like what they've already found from their disaggregated data. So yeah, that's something that like we heard from community members was happening occasionally, is like they were not taking that next step. So I would caution against that for sure.
I would say the other piece is also like, if you haven't fully gone sort of a 180 on data disaggregation, if you're going to report data, particularly policy orgs, organizations like United Way, like provide a disclaimer, people. Like say like, hey, while we're reporting this data in the Asian category, please understand that there are 50 different ethnicities, 100 different languages, varied economic experiences. Like, at least provide a disclaimer. But that's not even being done. Like, we're not even being footnoted.
I would also say, like, don't underestimate the power of qualitative data, and by that, just having conversations with folks in your community, right? Because the purpose is trying to better understand your students and your families and your educators potentially as well, so you can better support them. And so, like, if there are situations in which you're like, okay, there are a very small number of Pacific Islander students, for example, potentially, like, maybe the answer is then like having conversations with those families, building up your own cultural and historical knowledge, because like you can find sort of other ways towards the end goal as well. Don't forget like other parts of your toolkit here.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Quyen.
Oh no, Chanda, go ahead.
Jessica, that's beautiful in that when we passed the bill and we had to wait a full year, SEARAC funded research where we were able to train our young people to conduct the empathy interviews so that we can capture and elevate their stories. So we were like, we're not going to wait for this institution to tell our story. We're actually going to collect the qualitative data to tell our story. And that was also funded by Nellie Mae. And we blew up, graphs and had our first sort of like brochure. I'm like, hey, these were our findings. This is what Rhode Island Southeast Asian students are saying. So thank you for elevating that.
I wanted to also give or underscore Jessica's point, which is also that look at if the data disaggregation is telling you that students are doing really, really well, but the reality tells you something else, question that. And the reason why I say that is because I was in a forum with Long Beach Unified School District, and they actually, their data showed that Cambodian students were doing super well. And what they didn't share is that, and Long Beach Unified is, there are lots of great bright spots from that school district. They're kind of like a sweetheart in terms of data work at large. But one of the reasons why is because they don't capture students who, for example, transfer to adult education or continued education and are no longer part of the K-12 system. And nothing is reported out about those young people who do end up dropping out. And when I pushed back with additional census data that suggests, well, actually, more than half of the community is still in poverty. So if this is really happening, it's not making its change in terms of disrupting poverty and socioeconomic statuses at large, and it still is a problem. So we have to be prepared that data disaggregation may not always tell you the story alone of what is happening in the community.
Yeah, Quinn, if I could just jump in real quick, I think on one of our earlier calls, you sort of heeded us, especially when looking at, data for Asian American communities, is to really examine the intersections of, race, poverty, and immigrant status, right? I think that's, so important. Otherwise, we do end up with really dangerous and damaging narratives where districts are lumping Asian and white students together in terms of academic performance. I think from a funder's perspective, again, data disaggregated or aggregated is just one source of information, and it really should not be the end all be all for how we make funding decisions, right? Ultimately, the relationship building piece is going to be, I think, also very important, if not more important. And especially in communities where, data is underreported, right, for a variety of reasons. And I think just from a practical level, in the instances where, if foundation staff are not from the communities of color that you are serving, it's really important to have folks from the communities serving either on the board of directors or in an advisory role capacity, who can really, provide a lot of input on your strategy and funding decisions.
Excellent point, and that speaks to one of the comments left in the chat regarding ensuring that the data goes back to the communities where it's gathered and giving folks the opportunity to help shape the narrative and to have agency with respect to that data. One of the other themes brought up in some of the comments talks about the intersectionality of our identities and the complexity of people's lives. I'm wondering if you all can reflect a little bit on doing the work that you do and taking into consideration the intersectional identities with respect to gender, sexuality, language status, and other features, and how that factors into your work and what you want funders to walk away from this webinar knowing about.
So it feels like there are two parts to that question. So I'd say for the first part, like definitely something CAP is thinking about, and we're actually doing an event about this, is that, you know, in addition to understanding that Asian American and Pacific Islander are extremely diverse, it's also important to understand the intersections that exist between folks who hold multiple marginalized identities, including, you know, that the experience of Asian Americans with disabilities, or, you know, Asian Americans from low socioeconomic backgrounds, you know, those intersections will impact their experiences. And I can't say off the top of my head that I know exactly the way that like data collection can and should reflect that, but definitely something that like we are keeping in mind when we're recommending policies that, you know, are, for example, like another one of our policy areas is addressing mental health in the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, right? So I definitely think like we are thinking about the policy implications of those intersections. And then in terms of the second part of your question about like what funders should walk away from, I think the last slide that I had is kind of like the big takeaways for me, which is, you know, fund your community members and give them a little bit of like enough leeway for them to do what they know is right and what is right for their communities. To Ellen's point, you know, fund this work for multiple years, because it's not just going to be, you know, getting the state to pass legislation. It's going to be the logistics of implementation. It's going to be the logistics of policy change, you know, afterwards. And so it's going to be like a multi-year process, and you should be prepared to fund that as such.
And Jessica, I loved your remarks, especially the connection with mental health, because the example that I was thinking about around intersection is actually a research report that we did in California probably about 5 or 6 years ago with our youth. We had over 200 questionnaires that were collected, and we found that non-binary identified youth experienced higher rates of bullying and harassment compared to all of their other students. And at the policy level, the National All Students Count Act included cross-tabulation with gender as well as sexual orientation. And our partners at the National Women's Law Caucus was actually one of the biggest champions to make sure that that intersection existed. And we know that there are examples of national data sets where these additional data points are collected, including the CRDC, Civil Rights Data Collection. There's some challenges to that data set. And if folks have detailed policy questions that you all want to follow up with us on, please feel free to do so, because as a community, I recognize on this call that we actually have a lot of answers. And they're not perfect, but it is so much more than we knew 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I think that my takeaway is that the takeaway that I would leave folks with is that it's never too late to join the movement. And the moment is actually now, because the window of shifting the hearts and minds of philanthropy has never been as acute and as clear had it not been for COVID and had it not been for the escalation of anti-AAPI hate and violence. And we need to maximize on that window as much as possible. So that would be my takeaway for folks on the call.
Yeah, I will say that half the youth we serve One of our values is intersectionality. It's really recognizing that people have the right to be their whole selves and that people come into places with multifaceted identities and histories, right? So half of the young people we serve are biracial, multiracial, right? From very similar socioeconomic class. And some of our young people are half Lao and half Black, but are Black presenting. So what does that mean, right? Then we have students of color who also attend private schools. Like, we were founded to serve public school students, but we're learning as an organization, oh, wow, there is a huge need for Black and Brown students who are attending white dominated schools and practices, even if it's a private institution that's completely impacting their mental health. And what are those supports look like? And I will say, I always get my data from young people. Like, they will tell you the stories. It's not a secret formula, right? Like, you just center their voices and they will usually come up with the ways in which you can support these multifaceted identities.
I know that there are questions in the chat that I'm not sure we're going to get to. So definitely, echo Quyen's happy to, have my email be given out and answer any questions afterwards. But I think the other thing as a funder is just to think about the internal work that as an organization you need to do before or as you engage with communities. Because you definitely don't want to cause harm, right, as you're interacting with communities. So thinking through sort of like your internal biases, your policies, like, are you paying your community advisors? Are you paying, the folks that you talk to for their time? Sort of like, CAP, as we were shifting towards centering communities more in our work than we had in the past, we took 1.5 to 2 years to do a lot of our own internal race equity work, to understand as individuals, how we're approaching this work, how we understand this work, how this work applies to our own internal processes. And so, like, I think putting yourself into community spaces, especially where you have like more power, and having not done that work, I think you might carry some oppressive systems into those engagements.
So I think my takeaways for funders would be that, I think, and it's good to see, and nowadays a lot of funders are thinking more about a racial equity approach to their work. And I would say that when they talk about marginalized communities of color, to really please make sure that you are including Indigenous and Asian American communities, because I cannot tell you how I still see RFPs that talk about these communities and have excluded the Asian American community, for example. And I think, as funders are sort of engaging with disaggregated data, one word of caution, and something I've been thinking a lot about, is like, how do we not perpetuate a scarcity mindset whereby we are pitting communities of color against each other, and even communities within the Asian diaspora, against each other, right? So just to be, very careful and intentional about that.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time, but just wanted to surface that a lot of the questions in the chat regarding data privacy, and perhaps that's another topic that GFE can help us as a community dig a little bit deeper on in a separate session. Thank you for our panelists, and handing the reins over back to you, Olka.
Thank you to all of you. Quyen, Ellen, Jessica, Chanda, really appreciate you being here to share your stories and the examples of the work that you're doing. And Sue, thank you for being a wonderful moderator. For those who took the time to join us today, thank you so much. The video of this event will be available in about a week, and you can find a video to the first in our AAPI series on our website as well. We do have a couple of upcoming programs in the course of May, and we hope to see you there. In the meantime, have a great day.